This is apropos. Well, it's just the latest in a series of disputes heightening tensions between France and its former colony. Prime Minister François Bayrou is threatening to cancel a long-standing agreement with Algeria on free movement after a deadly knife attack in which the main suspect was a man of Algerian origin. Prosecutors say he was on a terrorism watch list and subject to deportation orders. Caroline Baum has the details.
In a standoff between France and Algeria, French Prime Minister François Bayrou is digging in his heels. He issued an ultimatum to the Algerian government, which has repeatedly refused the repatriation of its citizens from France, on Wednesday.
It's absolutely unacceptable that this situation persists. France will ask the Algerian government to re-examine the entirety of our agreements on the matter and how those agreements are carried out.
La totalité des accords et la manière dont ces accords sont exécutés.
If Algeria does not come to the negotiating table in 6 weeks, Bayrou threatens to nullify the 1968 accords between the two countries, which gives Algerians preferential treatment with regards to immigration in France. These French citizens of Algerian descent said they were saddened by the tense relations between the two countries.
It's regrettable. It's very clear that these are political measures.
It would be good to have dialogue and communicate as much as possible instead of making threats.
Over the past year, France and Algeria have clashed over France's support for Moroccan sovereignty in Western Sahara, the arrest of a French-Algerian writer in Algiers, and the French arrest of Algerian influencers for posts inciting violence. But migration remains the central element of the conflict. Without a response from the Algerian government, the decision of whether to get rid of the accords will fall to French President Emmanuel Macron.
For more, let's bring in William Lawrence, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University in Washington, D.C., also a former diplomat and North Africa Project Director at the International Crisis Group. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme this evening. Firstly, under the 1968 Accords, Algerians enjoy favourable treatment on immigration matters here in France. Tell us a little bit more about those accords and why this issue has been so controversial.
Well, Algerians have a special status. You know, a lot of people forget that Algeria was part of France, not just a colony or a protectorate the way Morocco and Tunisia were, but it was actually part of France. And there is a special relationship that neither side fully acknowledges or fully honors. Instead, we're at about the worst state of the relationship in decades, according to the people older than me. And these swirling problems are being fed by the political polarization that's going on, you know, globally and regionally between the countries, and by the unwillingness of each side to de-escalate. Rather, they're escalating for political reasons, which has to do with internal French and to a lesser degree internal Algerian politics. I just got back from Algeria and France and a wider trip to the region. And again, it's never been this bad. But that special relationship, that special status needs to be preserved, and it needs to be curated. And the largest immigrant community in France, certainly from the Arab world, is Algeria. It's a huge percentage of the population. Most of the French are there legally, and some of these people, most of the Algerians are there legally. And this one of the people they were trying to repatriate lived in France for 33 years. And the Algerians very reasonably said, look, adjudicate him in your own legal system. You don't have to send him back to us. But the idea that you have to send back someone who's been in France for 33 years, no matter what their crime is, you know, suggests that their nationality is more important than their crime. And so there's a lot of problems here that need to be resolved, and each problem is reinforcing the lack of resolving of the other problems. And, you know, it could get worse before it gets better. And, you know, I strongly urge both sides to make some de-escalatory moves rather than the escalatory moves we're seeing right now.
Of course, pressure being put on the government by hard or right conservative elements here in France. As recently as 2022, though, William, the Algerian president described a visit to Algeria by Emmanuel Macron as promising and constructive. So how have relations deteriorated to such an extent over such a relatively short period of time?
Well, I think leaders on both sides keep snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. So, for example, Macron, before and after his trip, had made some faux pas and didn't resolve them sufficiently. And same thing on the Algerian side. There's been moves where they could have had a successful diplomatic breakthrough and they didn't. A big piece of this is memory, the collective memory. And Macron, to his credit, started this historical commission that was supposed to lay bare the truths of that very fraught history between Algeria and France, and then retell the history in a way that was acceptable, and then we would have a collective common memory that would be part of the reconciliation. Instead, the commission failed. The person in charge of it, I don't think, had the right personality, even though he had the credentials. And then further mistakes were made both in characterizing the present, but also in characterizing the present in light of that past where there's a lot of disagreement. And so, this is a lot of work to be done here in the relationship. But I think the first side, the first step, is for each side to recognize the dignity of the other. And there's a lack there. And I'm not saying Americans aren't innocent of this crime. Americans have lots of problems with their lack of respect towards the dignity of others, whether it's our southern border or our relationship even with Europe. But it is true that just when you think there's going to be a positive breakthrough, such as the Macron visit of 22, things unravel again, in part because of the reflexes that French and Algeria have towards each other, which is more of a méfiance or lack of trust in the other, rather than embracing the common history these countries have had for so long.
And fast forward to 2025, both sides accusing the other of willfully inflaming tensions. Algeria saying this evening it categorically rejects ultimatums and threats. Do you believe that the French president will actually go as far as withdrawing from these accords?
I certainly hope not. When governments say we'll review this or that, often that review doesn't lead to the negative action. It's part of the diplomatic dance, the diplomatic pressure tactics. But it is true that Bayrou escalated. He didn't de-escalate. And we've had escalations on both sides, although I'd accuse France of doing more of the escalations, again, because of its internal politics. But it's very clear that France feels very strongly about these things and needs to make hay, where it could be actually operating a little bit of a more quiet manner. And again, that's because of the way in which the Algerian issue is kicked around in French politics, and Algerians are scapegoated for all kinds of things, both in an individual sense and in a collective sense. And again, Americans do it with Mexico, you name it. So again, the Americans aren't innocent, but there's a lot that France could do here to respect, to act in a dignified manner and respect the dignity of others, and to take steps in the direction of trying to resolve these problems rather than taking advantage of them for domestic political purposes.
And what would the consequences be for Algerians already living in France if the country were to withdraw from those accords?
All kinds of things. Again, I'm not a French immigration lawyer, but I have a pretty good idea as a former consular officer in the U.S. government, what this entails. But there are special privileges now for Algerians, both to immigrate and to establish residency in France, and then eventual citizenship. And the accords make that possible. So if the lives of Algerians gets more difficult, if it's easier to deport Algerians, then everybody's looking over their shoulder. Everyone's nervous. Families can't, come together and stay together. And if you look at the statistics, for example, and this is one of the big issues France has, I think 60% of French requests for laissez-passés to, allow the repatriation of people that have violated French law, that they can repatriate them to their country of origin, get accepted by the other country. That means 40% are rejected. Now, Algerians have been accepting about 42%, not 0%. So Algeria, I think, is doing its best to accept who it can. But if there are greater expulsions of Algerians from France and less Algerians coming in, that's ultimately bad for the relationship, because it's when there's more commerce, more exchange, more students going back and forth, and all the great things that come from international exchanges, the relationship gets better. And just by reducing the numbers and forcing people out, you're not going to fix anything.
And William, the French Prime Minister has also raised the question of the French-Algerian novelist Boualem Sansal, who's being held in Algeria on national security charges. Why has this become such a flashpoint?
Well, there's a long history here of writers, having problems in both states, but certainly writers that, like this gentleman, who was controversial in the Algerian context, and the French have every right, and I agree with the French on this and several of the issues, that he should be treated respectfully. He should be allowed to exit the country. He should be allowed to be treated with respect and let out of the judicial predicament that he's in. Instead, he was arrested, and this is now a bone of contention between the two countries. And it's bad for Algeria in another sense. I mean, I've been involved in a number of cultural projects, and was recently in Paris talking about Franco-Algerian cultural projects where there might be an American inputs. And it puts sort of a freeze on all of the relationships when people no longer have faith in the ability of artists to operate in a free manner and, be part of the cultural exchange between countries, even when they deal with prickly topics. And Sansal in particular has been, not friendly towards Islamists, something that a lot of Algerians and French people, including the Algerian government, are sympathetic with. But instead, he's fallen into trouble, and France should do what it can, given his huge role in let's say, the Franco-Algerian cultural conversation, to get him out. And certainly the Algerians would do well to let him go. But instead, he's become another pawn in this chess match where neither side seems to be doing what the other side wants.
It's a very interesting conversation, William, but we'll have to leave it there for now, unfortunately. Thanks so much for joining us. That's former diplomat William Lawrence. He's Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the American University in Washington, D.C. Well, that's it.